Hello everybody. In this video, you will learn the structure of an HTML file as well as a few basic HTML elements. I will walk you through the process of creating your very first web page, and by the end of the video, you will have created a very basic web page. Let's get started by opening up Visual Studio Code and creating a new file. Type any sentence you want into the file, such as "This is my first web page," and save the file. You can call this file anything you want, but it must have the extension .html at the end of the name. Now if you open that file in Google Chrome, you will see your web browser rendering the sentence you typed into the HTML file. While this technically works, the file we just created is not actually valid HTML. Behind the scenes, the browser is surrounding our sentence in valid HTML tags. To see what these tags look like, we will need to open the developer tools of Google Chrome. To do this, press Ctrl-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I if you are on a Mac. Upon doing this, you will be greeted with a fairly complex looking window. The data in these tabs is extremely useful in certain scenarios, but for this course, we will only care about the information in the Elements tab. The Elements tab shows us all the HTML elements our page is composed of, and as you can see, our page has 3 elements: HTML, head, and body. There is also a 4th element that every HTML page has, and this is called the doc type. The doc type is the first element of an HTML page and must be the first thing in the HTML file. The doc type tells the browser which version of HTML you are using. For all of our videos, we'll be using HTML as our doc type. This tells our browser to use the most up-to-date version of HTML available. The next element is the HTML element. This element tells the browser that all the code inside the HTML element is HTML. This tag should contain everything inside of your HTML file except the doc type and should come after the doc type. The head element is the next element and is technically optional. The information in the head element is never displayed in the browser, but is instead used to set information such as the title or description of the page. This element is generally the first element inside the HTML element, but it does not have to be. Our last element is the body element. The body element contains all the information that we want to display inside the browser. This can include text, images, videos, and much more. Try updating your HTML file to include all these elements and also change the text to something else, then save the file. You may notice that Google Chrome does not update and render your changes. In order to force Google Chrome to update, you will need to refresh the browser. This can become quite annoying though if you must refresh each time you make a change, so we'll download a plugin for Visual Studio Code called Live Server. This plugin will automatically refresh our browser every time we make a change. In order to download this plugin, go to the Extensions tab in the bottom left of the sidebar and type Live Server into the search bar. Next, click the Install button on the Live Server plugin and then click the Reload button after the install is complete. This will restart Visual Studio Code with the new plugin enabled. Now if you open your HTML file, you will see a Go Live button on the bottom of the screen. This button will open your HTML file in your default browser, and every time you save your HTML file, it will automatically reload your browser. You may notice that the URL in your browser has changed. It now looks something like this. This is because the Live Server plugin actually uses your computer as a server to serve the files to the web browser on your computer. Let's break down what this URL means. The first set of numbers from the URL, 127.0.0.1, is the IP address of your local host. This IP address is exactly the same on all computers and is the IP address of the computer's server. The second set of numbers after the colon is the port number. These two numbers work similarly to how an address of an apartment complex works. The IP address is like the address of the apartment complex, while the port number represents the apartment number of a single room in the apartment complex. If you do not specify a port number, the browser will automatically use port 80, which is the default port for HTTP communication. You now have all of the setup complete to efficiently develop HTML pages. We'll begin learning new HTML elements as well as the structure of an HTML element. We will also start building the project that we will work on over the duration of the entire Introduction to Web Development course. The project is to create a website for your favorite musician or band. I will walk you through the exact steps needed to create the website, and I will explain all the concepts along the way. As you follow along with this course, I want you to choose your favorite musician or band and create the website for them, instead of copying exactly what I do. In this video, we'll be creating the HTML for the About page of the band website. You may notice that it looks ugly now, but remember that HTML is only for the content of the site. Later, we'll use CSS to style the page. Let's get started by going over the structure of an HTML element. Most HTML elements are composed of a start tag, an end tag, and some content between these tags. The content inside these tags can either be text or other HTML elements. There are some tags, however, that have no content and thus have no end tag. These are called empty elements. The image tag is an example of an empty element. As you may notice, the image tag has an attribute called source. All HTML elements can have attributes set on them to define certain characteristics of the element, such as the source for an image tag. And that is all there is to an HTML element. We will now jump into the actual coding of the About page for the website and learn about many different types of HTML elements. Hello everybody, welcome to the coding section of this video. As you can see on the left side of my screen, I have Visual Studio Code open with the HTML from the previous video. I also have an images folder containing all of the images that we're going to be used to create the About page of this website. On the right of my screen, you can see the final version of the About page created for a band called The Generics. For you, this band will be completely different, but you should be able to follow the same template that I am using on this right side. In order to get started creating this band page, let's first right-click on our About page and click Open with Live Server. This will allow us to see our changes live as we make them. Now let's go back to the final band page and take a look at the different components of the page. The first thing you may notice is that at the top of the page we have a header. This header contains a navigation with 3 links going to the home page, the store page, and the About page, as well as a title for the band The Generics. There's also a line in between the two separating them. Let me paste in some code that will render this for us. Now let me open this code in the browser. As you can see, we have our navigation links at the top of the page, our title at the bottom, and a horizontal line separating them. And let me explain how this works. First, all of our content is wrapped with this header tag. This header tag is just a way of telling the browser that this is a header element. It doesn't apply any styling to these elements, it just says this block of code is the header for our page. The next element inside of our page is the nav element. This is very similar to the header element in that it doesn't apply any styling, but it tells the browser that this is the navigation section of our web page. You could have multiple navs throughout your page, but most likely you're going to just have one nav either in the top of your page or on the side of your page. Next, we have the UL element. This stands for unordered list. There are 2 types of lists that you can create in HTML, an OL, which is an ordered list, and a UL, which is an unordered list. In our case, we are using an unordered list, or a UL, because the elements in our list have no particular order to them. Next, we have 3 LI elements. LI elements stand for list item and can only be used inside of a UL or an OL. These denote the actual items of your list, and as you can see on the right, are styled with a bullet point when they're inside of an unordered list, and they are styled with numbers when they're inside of an ordered list. Next, we have an HR element. This element, as you can see, has no closing tag, which means it is an empty element. This HR element supplies us this horizontal line in our page and stands for horizontal rule. Lastly, we have an H1 element. The H1 element is a heading element, and there's 6 different sizes of heading elements. There's the H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. Each one is progressively smaller than the last one, with the H1 being the largest and the H6 being the smallest. Now let's go back to our final version of the web page and look at the next section of code that we have. This is the About section. At the top you can see that we have a header element, which is called About, a grouping of text with an image, and another group of text. Let me paste over some code that will define this section and view this in the browser. As you can see, we have that About heading, a grouping of text, our image, and another grouping of text. On the left here we can view the actual code and break it down. The first thing you'll notice is that we have a section element that wraps all of the other code in this section. The section element is very similar to a header element in that it implies this is a grouping of stuff that is all inside of one section. While the header element says this is the header of our page, the section element says this is just a generic section of some form in which all of the content is related. Next, we have an H2 element for the About header. This is very similar to our H1 header, except for that an H2 header is always going to be smaller than an H1 header because H1 is the largest header, H6 is the smallest as you remember, so H2 is just one step below an H1. And as you can see on the right here, our H1 for the generics is larger than our H2 for about. Next, we have a P element, also known as a paragraph element. A paragraph element defines a grouping of text that is usually long-form, paragraph-form text with many sentences, and it is much smaller font than our headings. Next, we have an image tag. The image tag, as you can see, is an empty element and has no end tag. It also has this source attribute that we talked about earlier. The source attribute defines the path to the image to be displayed on the page in relation to the actual page you're on. So as you can see, we are in this about.html page, and in the images folder we have an image called bandmembers.png. So in order to get this image, we go into the images folder and then get the image bandmembers.png. This must be a path related to the about.html file. So if we moved this about.html file into our images folder, for example, then this path would have to be bandmembers.png as opposed to images/bandmembers.png. And if we reopen this in live server, you'll see that this now works. Let's move that back to where it was though. And then make this images/bandmembers.png and open it in live server again. And there we go, the image works now. And lastly, we have another paragraph element with another section of text. Now let's go back to our final page and look at the last element that we have, the footer element. As you can see in the footer, we have the generics heading as well as a YouTube image, a Spotify image, and a Facebook image. Let me paste over some code that will define this in HTML and view this in the browser. As you can see, we have that heading as well as our 3 images. If we go over and look at the actual HTML code, you'll notice that almost all of the elements are something that we've already used before. The footer element, just like the header and section element, defines a grouping of text and HTML that is going to be in the footer of the page, which is almost always going to be at the very bottom of your page. We then have our H3 element, which just like the H2 and H1 is a large text heading for the page, and it is going to be smaller than the H2 element. We then have another unordered list with 3 list items in it, and each one has an image which links to the Facebook logo, Spotify logo, and YouTube logo in our images folder. And that's all there is to creating the HTML for this about page. As you may notice, our actual final page looks very different than what our current page looks like, but that is because this final page is styled using CSS. As you remember from earlier videos, HTML is only used to define the content of the page, and this right here is all of the content that goes onto our page. The styling for the fonts, font size, background colors, and all these images, that'll all come later in CSS. All of the content though, the HTML, is complete for this about page. Some common problems that you may run into as you create the HTML for your own band about page is that you forget to include the ending tag for your HTML elements. If you do this, your HTML will not look correct, or it may not even render at all. In order to check that you have created all of the ending tags for your HTML elements, if you click on either the start tag or the end tag, Visual Studio Code will automatically highlight the ending tag for you, or the start tag if you'd selected the ending tag. This is an easy way to check if you have actually created the ending tags and starting tags for all of your elements. Another common problem is with your images not displaying. In order to get around this problem, make sure that the path for your image is in relation to your actual HTML page that it is on. For example, our About page is in the same folder as the Images folder, so we must first navigate through the Images folder to get to the images inside of it. We'll dive into more HTML elements as we build the home page of the band website, and by the end of this video, we'll have created all of the HTML needed for the home page of our website. Before we get started coding, let's cover a few of the concepts that we will be utilizing, starting with HTML elements. If you have ever tried to use a greater than or less than sign in the text of your HTML, you may notice that it does not render and actually messes with your entire page rendering. This is because these symbols, along with many more, are special symbols that are used in HTML for signifying start and end tags. In order to render these symbols, we must use HTML entities. An HTML entity is written by writing an ampersand and pound sign followed by the number that corresponds to the symbol. For example, this is the code that will render the less than symbol. Remembering which numbers correspond to which symbols can be quite difficult though. This is why the most common symbols, such as the less than sign, have a name that can be used instead of the number. This is the code for the less than symbol using the name as opposed to the number. When you use the name of the symbol instead of the number, make sure that you do not include the pound sign after the ampersand. The next major concept is the idea of meaningless elements. So far, we have only learned about elements that have inherent meaning. For example, the header element is used to wrap the header of a page, the nav element is for the navigation section, and the h1 element is for a heading. HTML has many elements that have specific meaning, but sometimes a section of your page does not have any special meaning, or there is no HTML that conveys the meaning you want. This is where meaningless elements come in. There are two different meaningless elements, div and span. These elements are the same in every way, except that the div element is a block element, meaning that it will appear on a separate line from the content around it, similar to the paragraph tag. The span element, on the other hand, is an inline element and thus appears in line with the content around it. If this does not make sense yet, the differences between these two elements will become apparent as we write the HTML for this lesson. Essentially, all you need to know about meaningless elements is that they should be used anytime you need to group together HTML that either has no meaning or there is no HTML tag to describe the meaning. Now that we got that out of the way, let's jump into the coding of the homepage for the band website. Hello everybody, welcome to the coding section of this video. As you can see on the left, I have Visual Studio Code open with the project we left off in the last video, and on the right, I have the final version of the band homepage. To get started, we should copy the about.html page and rename it to index.html. This is because the about page shares the same header and the same footer as our homepage. We now can get rid of the section in the middle that contains the about content since we will not need that on the homepage. The reason that we named this page index.html is because the index page is the page that is shown when you leave nothing after the website URL. So if we remove this /index.html and hit enter, you'll see that it renders the exact same thing that is inside the index.html. And if we change this, save it, you'll see it shows up there. Now let's get started with the actual content of this page. Let's jump back to the image that we have to use as a reference and get started with the header. As you can see, inside the header we have an additional button for Get Our Latest Album and another button for the Play button. To create these elements, we'll use the button element. The button element will render a button on the page as we can see here, and if we give it some text, such as what is on this page, Get Our Latest Album, you'll see that it renders a button that we can click on our page. Let's do the same exact thing for the Play button. Now we can't actually just show this image with a normal button key press. We have to use an HTML entity that we talked about earlier. The code for this entity is as follows. This will render the play button as we can see here. As you may notice, our two buttons on this same line as opposed to on different lines like they are in this image. This is because the button is an inline element as opposed to a block element. In order to get around this problem, we can use a tag called the line break tag, which is the BR tag. The BR tag adds a line break wherever it is, so if we put it after this button, it'll create a line break right here before the next button. And if we save that, on the right you can see that they are on separate lines. Now we want a little bit more spacing than this between our elements, so we'll use another line break element in order to create a little bit of a gap between our two buttons. That is all the HTML that we're going to need for the header section. But as you can see in this homepage view, that there is a giant background image that is applied for the entire header. In order to remind us that we need to create this background image and find it later, let's add a comment into the code. To do this, use an exclamation point followed by 2 dashes, which will create a comment in the code. Comments do not actually render any information on the HTML page, but they show up in the code so that you can remind yourself or other people that use this code what certain things mean or what to do. So for example, let's create just a to-do comment that tells us that we need to find a suitable background image. There we go. So now if we go back to our page, you can see that that does not actually render, but it shows up in the code for us to reference later. Now let's go on to the middle section of our page. In the middle section of our page, we will use a section element just as we did for the About section of our code to wrap all of this stuff in our Tours section. And you can see that we have a header called Tours just like we had in the About section, so let's create an H2 and add the text Tours into that and view that to make sure that that shows up correctly. Next, we have a few rows that display all of the tour dates for our upcoming tours of the generics band. There is no actual HTML element to denote a row, for example, in this scenario, so what we are going to do is we are going to wrap our entire set of rows in a div, which is a meaningless element that we talked about earlier. This will make it a block element, so that way these items will not appear on the exact same line as each other. We will then wrap each individual row in a div of its own. So this outside div here is wrapping all of these rows, and then each one of these rows has its own div that will contain just the text inside of it. Now let me add the text inside of the rows. Now, as you can see, if we go over to our page, we have the different text rendered for all of the text in the row. But it doesn't quite look right. First off, we need this July 16th date to be bolded. In order to do this in HTML, we will use what's called a strong tag. The strong tag denotes something that is important. In most cases, it means that the text inside of the strong tags will be bolded, but in some scenarios, the text will actually not be bolded. For example, if you're using a screen reader, if you are blind, the text will have special emphasis when it speaks it back to you because you cannot actually see bold versus non-bold. Let's put our July 16th inside of that strong tag, save it, and go back to our browser to see that that is actually bolded now. Next, we have the text for Detroit and the text for the actual place that the performance is in. Let's wrap these in span tags. Span tags are the other meaningless element that we talked about, and this denotes an inline element. If we go to our rendered version of our page, you can see that these elements do not break the lines as these block elements from the div do. If we were to change this to be a div, you can see that now it breaks both on the top and the bottom of the line. Let's change that back to a span. Lastly, we need to create the button for our final element. Let's wrap this buy tickets text inside of a button element. Now if we go back to our page, we can see that that is now a clickable button. One more thing to note about these buttons is that they can have a type to them, which is an HTML attribute. In this case, you can have the type of button, menu, reset, or submit. In our case, since this is just a generic button, we want to use the button type. Let's copy that and paste that into our other buttons as well, since they are also generic buttons. Lastly, we need to add an HR element that we talked about in the previous video to the end of our row because we have this underline here that we want to incorporate. Now if we go back, we can see that we have this underline under our row. You may notice though that the text is very close together with almost no spacing between them. You may think that in order to fix this, you can add a bunch of spaces after your text, and if you save that, you would think that a bunch of spaces would show up after this. But if you save it, you see that that does not happen. HTML actually removes all of the extra spaces after any element, whether it's a space, a tab, even if you put an enter new line in here and save it, it'll remove all of those at the end of your element. In order to get around this and actually include some space in between our elements, we're going to use temporary, the less than, and greater than symbols that we talked about earlier with the HTML entities. Let's go after our strong tag here and write the code for less than and the code for greater than. Now you can see that we have a little bit of a space between our text. Let's copy and paste this in between all of the different elements of the row. And now there's a little bit of spacing so that it is easier to see which element is which. The last thing that we need to do in order to get our page to be exactly the same as this is copy this row and create all of the text needed for the rest of these rows. I'm going to do that real quick now. We now have all of the code that we need for these sections. If we go back to this page, we can see that all of our rows are now being rendered, and they all look correct, except you see that we have this additional underline on the last row. So go back to our code and remove that final HR element. Now we have exactly the same HTML that we have on this page. Last thing we should do is delete this placeholder text that we added in here at the beginning, and now we are perfect. The only thing left to do is to add some elements to the head. As you can see at the top, this title of our page just shows the URL of the page that we are on. If we want to change that, we can use a title element in the head section of our HTML. This will actually not show up anywhere on the body of our page, but it will be used by the browser to set the title of our page on the tab. Let's just set the title to the generics. And if we save, you can see that now it recreates the title of our page. Another common element in the head section is a meta tag. The meta tag has a bunch of different things that we can define for it based on what we set for the name attribute, but in our case, we want to set the description of our page. This description is used by the browser to show a little bit of a description of your page under the title whenever you search in Google, for example, along with other places. For us, let's just set any title, which we set inside of the content section of this tag. Let's just say this is the description, and close off that meta tag. Now, as you see, when we save, nothing actually changes on our page because this is inside of the head of our page. If we were to upload this page to the internet and do a Google search for it, you'll see that this description will show up underneath of the title of our page inside of the Google browser results. Now let's go to our About page and do the exact same thing inside of the head. Just paste this in here, change the title from the generics to the generics About, and we can keep the description exactly the same. That's all that there is to creating the HTML for our index page. We'll dive into one more crucial HTML element as we build the store page of the band website. By the end of this, we'll have created all of the HTML that we need for the entire project. Before we get started coding, we need to cover one of the most important and most common HTML elements, the anchor tag. The anchor tag, also known as the A tag, is the HTML element that allows us to add links to our web pages. The structure of the anchor tag is very similar to that of an image tag, but instead of specifying a source attribute for an image, an anchor tag uses an href attribute, which stands for hypertext reference. The href attribute works exactly like the source attribute when trying to find the file you specified. This means that the href attribute value should be relative to the HTML file that the anchor tag is in. For example, if you had a file called page.html in the same folder as the HTML file with the anchor tag, then you would use page.html as the href of the anchor tag to link to page.html. Another use of the href tag is to link to other web pages by their URL. This also works exactly the same as the source attribute of the image tag. If you want to create a link to Google, then you would create an anchor tag and set the href to Google's URL. This URL must be the full URL of the website, which includes HTTP at the beginning. In order for an anchor tag to work, the href attribute must be defined. Another common attribute, the target attribute, on the other hand, is optional. The target attribute specifies where the link should open. By default, the value of the target attribute is self, which means the link should open in the current browser tab. The only other value for the target attribute is blank. That means that the link opens in a separate tab. Don't forget to make sure you include the underscore in the front of the self and blank target attribute values, or they will not work. We will cover both target types in the coding section of this video, so if this does not make sense yet, it will become obvious in a bit. Now that we got that out of the way, let's jump into the coding of the store page for the band website. Hello everybody, welcome to the coding section of this video. As you can see, on the left I have Visual Studio Code open with the project from the last video that we left off on. The only difference is that inside the images folder, I've added all the images that we're going to need to create the store page of the band website. On the right of my screen, I have a picture of the store web page pulled up so we can use this as a reference to create the HTML for the band page. Let's get started by copying the about.html page and renaming it to store.html. This is because our store page and our about page both share the same header and the same footer. Now let's delete the content in the center about the about page that we do not actually need in the store page. What we do need is we need to create a section for the music, a section for merch, and a section for cart. Let's do that. Inside of each of these sections, we're also going to have a header for the title of Music, Merch, and Cart. Now let's take a look at the content inside of each of these sections. As you can see, the Music and Merch section both share the same template for its content, where it has an album or t-shirt or coffee cup, whatever is being sold, a picture of that, the price of it, and then a button to add it to the cart. So let's create these elements. What we're going to want to do, we're going to want to wrap this entire element inside of a div element, so that way we know it is one contained content. Inside of that div, we're going to want to have a div for the album name. This is because we want this to be on its own line, so we can't just use a span. And inside of that div, since this is bolded, we'll use a strong tag to put the title of album 1. Next, we're going to want to add the image tag, and it's going to have a source attribute, which in our case is going to be images/album1.png. And lastly, we need to add a final div that's going to wrap both the price and button for adding to cart. We're going to put the price inside of a span, and then we're going to add the button for add to cart, and make sure to add the role of button, since this is just a generic button. Now let's open that up using Live Server to see what our changes look like. As you can see, we have the album name, picture of the album, and then the line containing the price, and the button to add to cart. The only thing left to do now is to copy this and paste it down 4 times so that we have a section like this for all of the albums that we are selling in the music section of our store. I'm going to do that now. Now if we open that up, we can see that we have our 4 different albums being displayed with the title at the top, picture in the middle, and price and button at the bottom. You may notice, however, though, that they are all on an individual line as opposed to being side by side as they are in this image. This is because we are wrapping all of them inside of a div, and divs break the line as we talked about earlier. Later we are going to fix this in the CSS portion of our course, but for now we will just keep it like this because, as you remember, HTML is only for content, and CSS is where we talk about layout and display. Now if we go back to the image of our store page, we can see that in the merch section we have almost the exact same layout that we do inside of the music section of our store. So I'm just going to copy one of the templates from the music section, paste it into the merch section, and change it accordingly. Now if we go view this, you'll see that these also show up at the bottom inside of the merch section. The last thing that we have to look at is the cart section of our store. This is slightly different than the rest of our sections and includes a few new elements that we haven't talked about yet. Let's first get started by creating the header row of item, price, and quantity. To do this, we will wrap all 3 of these in a div so that they appear on the same line, and we will use strong tags to wrap all the content because it is bolded. Now if we go take a look at that, we'll see that we have item, price, and quantity all displayed on the same line, but we will use the same spacing trick that we used in the last video in order to show the space between these because right now it is difficult to read. So in our code we're going to add a less than and a greater than sign. This will add a little bit of spacing between our elements. We'll just copy this one more time so it's between price and quantity as well. Next we are going to work on adding in each of the individual rows of this section. We'll do this by using another div tag to wrap the entire row, followed by an image tag to store the image for the first item. We'll use the source to be album 1, as we talked about earlier, and close that, and we will go look at it, and we'll see that this image is way too large. We want this image to be much smaller. In order to do that, we can set a width and height property on the actual image element itself. This attribute we're going to set to 100, which will stand for 100 pixels. If we leave off the height element, it'll automatically adjust the height to be in aspect ratio with the width. So if we had an image that was 200 pixels by 400 pixels, so 200 pixels wide, 400 pixels tall, and we set the width to 100, the new height would be 200, which would automatically be set. If we, however, set both the height and the width, it'll automatically set both those for us to be 100 and 100. Next, we're going to want to add the name of the actual item inside of a span. We'll just call this t-shirt, and then we'll want to add in the price inside of a span as well. And between those, we're going to want to use the less than and greater than signs that we talked about for our spacing. Now if we view that, we'll see that we have the name of the item followed by the price of the item. Next, we need to add in this input that allows users to select the quantity of item that they want, where they can type in any number that they want in here. In order to do this, we're going to use an input element. An input element is an empty element that allows us to create an input of various different types. In this case, we're using a number input, so we'll set the type equal to number. There are many different types of input that you can create, but the most common types are a number input and a text input. We will then close that off, and if we go back to our page, we'll see that we have an input in here that allows us to enter only numbers into it. We cannot enter anything that is not a number, just numbers. But in our example, you can see that we have this pre-populated with a 1. In order to do this, we'll set the value property. The value property corresponds to the value of the actual input element, and as we change it, as we type in different numbers into the input, this value will automatically adjust to be the same as whatever number we typed in here. So over here, let's just put the value of 1 because that is what is in our picture here. I'm also going to use the same spacing tricks that we talked about with the less than and greater sign to add a space between this price and the input. And lastly, we need to add in a button. This button will have the role of button because it is a generic button, and inside of it we'll just put the text remove. Now if we go back to our page, we can see that we have all of the elements here that we have in our image over here. Now let's copy this div one time and fill it in with the information from the second row down here. Now if we go back, we can see that we have the correct information here. I also changed this first image to be the shirt image because I forgot to change that. And as we can see, we have the value of 2 in here, which corresponds to the value of the input element here. Lastly, let's add an HR after all of these in order to put that line at the bottom of the page that we have here before we get to total. The reason I'm not including an HR under these item, price, and quantity views is because we will add these later with CSS. This is because an HR takes up the entire space that is given, which in our case will be all the way from the far left of our page to the far right of our page with no breaks in between. Now let's add a final div which is going to contain the information for the total and the price. As we can see, the total is emphasized with bold, so we'll use a strong tag and type in total, and then we will have the price inside of a span. Lastly, we want to add this purchase button at the very bottom underneath of everything else, so inside of a div of its own, so that it is on its own line, we'll add in a button with the role of button, and we will give it the text of purchase. And that's all there is to creating this HTML here. And as we can see, if we look over here, we have all of the elements that we have on this page created in HTML here. The last thing we have left to do is add in links so that we can navigate with the home, store, and about buttons that we have up here. In order to do that, let's scroll up to the very top and wrap this text inside of an A tag, as we talked about earlier, so that now our text is a link. But in order for this link to work, we need the href that we talked about earlier. Since our store page is in the same page as our index page, which is our home page, all we need to type in is index.html, and now when we save this, we'll have a link here that when we click on it will bring us to the index.html page. Now let's go back to the store page and do this for all of our different links. Now you can see that we have buttons for the home page, store page, and the about page, and when clicked on, they'll bring us to the different pages. At the very bottom, you'll notice that we also have buttons for YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook. So now we need to add anchor tags wrapped around this. But as you can see, there's no text for us to wrap around. All there is this image tag. But that is okay. We can wrap this image tag inside of an anchor tag and it'll work as a button. In order to do this, create the anchor tag, give it a href, which in this case is going to be the URL of YouTube, which is https://youtube.com. and then we will put the image tag inside of this A tag. Now when we save that, if we hover over YouTube, we can see that there's a button, and if we click it, it'll bring us to youtube.com. Let's do the same thing for Spotify and Facebook. Now if we save that, we can see that the YouTube link, Spotify link, and Facebook link are all working. As you can see, we click here, we go to the Spotify website, and so on. But one problem is that when we click these links, it'll override the tab that we're in, and we don't want that for these bottom links. So we're going to use the target attribute on our href, and we're going to set it to _blank. I'm going to copy this over to all the rest of our links. And now when we click on a link for Spotify, for example, it'll open in a new tab while keeping the tab for our original page. Now, all we need to do is copy these new links that we created over to our home and our about page, and our HTML will be completely finished for the entire website. And there we go. Now if we go to any of these pages, you'll see that we have links that work on all of our pages. One last thing that I forgot to mention is that in our store page, we want to change the title of our page from the generics about to the generics store. And there we go. That is all the HTML that we need for this entire project. In our next set of videos, we'll be covering CSS. CSS is what is going to allow us to take this boring, bland looking HTML and converting it over to this beautiful looking mockup that we have over here. After we're done with CSS for all of our pages, we're then going to jump into JavaScript, which will allow us to make our store page interactive. This will make it so the add cart button actually adds elements to the cart down here, the remove element actually removes them, and changing the numbers inside of the quantity will actually update the total. And that is all there is to HTML. While we have covered many HTML elements, there are still many more HTML elements that we have not covered. I have only selected the most important and useful HTML elements to cover in this introductory course because many of the HTML elements are either obsolete or only useful in very specific scenarios. We're going to be taking the banned web pages that we created and style the about page to look exactly as this image on the right here. To give you an idea of what we're starting with, over here is going to be our about page that we have currently designed with just the HTML and no CSS. Also, as a side note, before watching this video, if you know nothing about CSS, make sure you watch my Learn CSS in 20 Minutes video in order to get primed on what you'll need to know in order to watch this video and follow along. Now let's get started into the CSS design for this page. The first thing I want to note is that I've added a fonts folder into our project and included the two fonts that we're going to be using to style some of our elements. I also, in our images folder, changed our bandmembers.png to be a square image so that it'll fit perfectly inside of a circle, and I changed our footer images, the Facebook logo, Spotify logo, and YouTube logo, to be white instead of black so that they're going to show up on top of our light blue background that our footer will have. Now that we have that out of the way, let's create our CSS file that we're going to be writing all of our code in. We're just going to call this styles.css. Then, inside of our about.html page, in the head, let's add in a link, give it a rel of style sheet, and an href of style.css. Now if we save that, nothing over here will change because we don't actually have anything loaded into our styles.css. But to test this, let's just give our HTML a background color, and we'll make it red. If we save that, perfect. Our background changes to red, which means that everything in our styles.css is being loaded into our about.html page. Now let's clear that out of the way and get started. The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to style the header portion of our site. If we go into our about.html page here, we see that on our header we have our navigation, which is these three buttons at the top here, as well as our header for the generics, which is our band name. The very first thing that we're going to do is give our header element a background image that is equal to the background image that you see over here. In order to do that, let's first give our header a class, and we'll just call it main header. In our styles.css, we'll use a selector to select that class, and then use the background image property to set an image for our background. Now this background image property works very similar to the href for an anchor tag. We'll use URL, and then inside of the URL, we'll specify where our image comes from. In our case, the image comes from our images folder over here, this header background.jpg. So we'll just put inside of here images / header background.jpg. If we save that and go back to here, we'll see that our image is going to be behind here. Right now this doesn't quite look right though. In order to fix that, we're going to use the background size property and set this to cover. What this is going to do is it's going to tell the background to expand as much as it can until one of the borders is at the very edge of either the width or the height, so it'll expand either as wide as it can or as tall as it can until it can't get any larger without surpassing the size of the image. So if we save that, you see that our image has expanded all the way as wide as it can and as tall as it can, and the last edge to hit is the width. This is the full width of our image, and it cut off the top and the bottom of our image. That's exactly what we want our image to do. This means that if we resize our page, our image will grow and shrink as needed without us having to enter any extra code. As you can see in our example photo, the background image has a slightly darker hue to it than over here, so in order to do that, we're going to add a second background. This time we're going to use a background color, and we're going to set it to RGBA, and we'll just use black with a 60% transparency. Now if we save that, you'll see that nothing actually changed about our background. This is because by default you can only use either a background color or a background image. To get around this, we're going to use what's called background blend mode. This is essentially telling the browser how do you want to blend these two different backgrounds together, and we're going to use multiply, which is essentially just going to combine these two together over top of each other. And as you can see on the right, we now have a grayish dark color to our background instead of it just being entirely opaque. Now all we need to do is add a little bit of padding underneath of this lettering down here so that we match the spacing we have over here. And to do that, we can just use padding bottom, and we'll set it to something like 30 pixels. If we save that, we now have a nice gap on the bottom here. You may also notice that around our background image, we have some white spacing between here, even though in our about.html, this is the very first thing in our body. This is because CSS styles are being defaulted onto certain elements such as the HTML element and the body element. If we go into our style sheet, and at the very top here just put HTML and body as our two selectors, and we set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0, we save that, we'll see that now those margins and paddings go away on the side here. But we still have a margin on the top. This is because our UL element also has a default margin on the top. So if we go in, set our UL element to have a margin of 0 as well, and save that, you now see that our background takes up the entire width and goes all the way to the very top of our page. Generally though, you don't want to style using elements such as getting rid of the margin on all ULs. So in our about here, we're going to give our nav a class of nav to indicate that this is our navigation. And in here, we use the nav class that we just created, followed by UL to say that all the ULs inside of the nav will now have no margin. If we save that, this will look exactly as before, but now all of our normal ULs will still have a margin, but the ULs inside of a navigation class will not have a margin. Now before we get started on styling the nav, we're going to want to use the everything selector to set a few general styles that will apply to all the elements in our HTML. The first one that we're going to want to use is box sizing, and we're going to want to set this to border box. What this does is it makes it so that the size of our elements are determined by the padding and the margin as well as the actual size of the content. So if we had a box and we set the width to be 200 pixels and we set the padding to be 20 pixels, without border box, the width of that object would be 200 pixels wide plus 20 pixels on the right for padding and 20 pixels on the left for padding, making it 240 pixels wide. With border box though, the width attribute takes into account the padding as well. So if we set a width of 200 pixels, our element will be exactly 200 pixels wide, and the padding will be on the inside of those pixels. If that doesn't make any sense, we'll be able to see more examples of this as we continue on styling this page. Another attribute that we want to apply to all of our elements is going to be our font family. This will be the default font family that all of our text is going to use. In our case, we're going to use the Railway font, but since this font is not a generic font that can be used on websites, we need to import this font. In order to do that, we're going to use Google Fonts and import it using this URL. This URL can be found on the Google Fonts webpage, and you can search for any font on there that you want, and then all you have to do is click on that font, click the import, and it'll give you this link to copy and paste into your CSS. Now if we save this, you'll see all of our font will change to Railway. The last thing that I want to apply to all of our elements is a default text color. In general, black on white is very high contrast and can be tiresome on your eyes to read, so I like to use a more subtle text color of 777 here, which is just going to be a light gray, which is much easier on the eyes to read. Now that we have that out of the way, let's style our navigation element. First, let's go to our about.html and remove this HR tag. This HR tag was only there to add an underline for our navigation, but we'll do that in CSS as borders are much easier represented in CSS. I also want to give our navigation another class of main nav. This is because we will have multiple different types of navigations that we want to style similarly, but we only have one main navigation that's going to be at the top of our page. So now if we go back to our styles.css, let's style our actual nav class first. We've already made it so that the margin is 0, so that our nav will no longer have any margins around it, but we want to maybe make our elements so that they are in line with each other as opposed to on separate lines as they are over here. To do this, we'll select the nav element, and then we'll select the li elements under that nav, and we will give them a display of inline. This tells us that the browser should render all of these elements in line with each other as opposed to on separate lines, which is the default for a list. Next, we want to style the actual links themselves that are in our navigation element. To do this, we want to give them some padding, so let's say we'll use a padding of 0.5 em, which will just space out these elements a little bit from each other. We also want to give them a white text color to match our mockup that we have of our image. And then lastly, we want to set it to text decoration none, which will remove that underline from underneath of our elements over here. And if we save that, we see that our text decoration has removed the underline from these elements, changed the color to white, but our padding has only added padding to the left and right, and not the top and bottom, as padding should do when you give it just one number. This is because these are inline elements, and inline elements cannot apply padding on the top or bottom. What we need to do is we need to change the display to be inline block. Inline block is very similar to inline, except for it allows you to do certain things such as add padding and height to elements that inline elements do not allow you to do. So now as you see, we have padding on the top, bottom, left, and right of all of these elements due to being inline block. The last thing we want to do is we want to make it so that it is easy to tell which element we're hovering over to give the user some feedback. To do this, we'll style the A tag again, and we'll use the hover selector to say when we hover over the element, we want to do something. And all we want to do is change the background color, and we'll just use a light grayish color here. So we'll use white. But we'll use transparency of 30%. So the white will show mostly as gray. And as you can see, when we hover over these elements, we are now getting a background color that tells us, hey, this is being hovered. This is all the styles that we want to apply to our general navigation though. Now we want to move on to our main nav class, because this is going to be styles that are applied to only the main navigation and not all of our other navigations. The first thing that we want to do is we want to make it so the text will be in the center of our screen, since our navigation should be centered at the very top of the screen. We also want to make it so the font size is a little bit bigger so it is easier to read. We'll just use 1.1 em, which will make it about 10% bigger. And then we'll change the font weight to be lighter, as opposed to the stronger font weight, so that way it blends a little bit better into the background. And then lastly, we want to add a border bottom to our element to replace that HR that we deleted, and it'll be 1 pixel wide, completely solid, and we'll just use another light gray color here. And if we save that, we now see that we have a border on the bottom and our elements at the very top. The last thing that we need to do is space out our elements from each other, because right now they're very close to each other. To do this, we'll use the main nav again, and we'll select the LI elements, and we'll just give them a little bit of padding. So we'll say padding of 0 on the top and bottom, and 5% on the left and right. There we go. Now our elements are spaced out from each other, and as our screen grows, the elements stay spaced out from each other, and as it shrinks, they stay spaced out again. The last thing we have to style on our header is going to be the actual name of the band here. If we go back to our mockup over here, you see that this is going to be much larger and of a completely different font than we have right here by the default. So to do this, let's go back to our about page and let's add a class here, and we'll just call it band name. We'll also add a second class of band name large, because we have 2 instances where our band name will be rendered. Once in the header, where it is very large, and a second time in the footer, where it is a more normal size. This is why we are going to use this band name class to style all of the elements that we need to make the band name look good, and then this band name large class to make the band name in the header larger. Let's first start with the just normal band name class. In this class, we're going to first want to make the text align center. This will cause it to appear in the center of the screen. And then we want to remove all margins from this element, because H1 elements by default have margin. If we save that, it'll get squished a little bit closer together. And then we want to increase the font size. And since this is just going to be our normal band name and not the large one, we're just going to use this font size of 4EM and save that. Then we want to change the font family. This font family is going to be Booter 0, 0, but if we save that, you'll see on my local machine this updates to be the correct font, but that's because I have Booter 00 installed on my computer. Normally this will not be the case, especially when you upload your website to be hosted somewhere else. In order to load this style in, we first want to grab our font files here, and we want to import them using the @fontface property. In here, we want to use the font family. This essentially tells our browser what name do we want to use for this font. We are going to use Booter 00. This is the name that you will set when you set the font family down here. Then we need the source. This essentially tells the browser where is this font coming from. This is just like the background image URL. So we're going to use fonts/Booter00, and we'll use the first one here, the WOFF, and tell it that this format is WOFF. Then we want to import our other source, which is URL fonts Booter00 WOFF2. Let me get rid of these backslashes here. And we'll use the format of WOFF2. This tells the browser that we have these 2 different types of fonts here, the Booter00 WOFF and Booter00 WOFF2, and it tells it which format is each one. The reason we have multiple sources is because some browsers don't support all types of sources, such as WOFF2 or just the normal WOFF. So now with having multiple sources here, the browser will take the very first source, and if that one works, it'll use it. And then if that one's not acceptable, it'll go down to the second source here. Lastly, we want to put a font weight, which tells us what weight is this font, and it is just normal. And same with font style. This is just a normal font, not italics or anything, so we'll put normal here. Now we have that font loaded into our page, so we have Butter00 that is normal and normal styled. But over here you see that our font is bolded and doesn't quite look the same as our mockup. This is because H1 tags by default bold their font. To get around this, we're going to set the font weight to be normal, and if we save that, our font now looks exactly as it does over here. The last thing we need to do is set the color of the font to be white, and if we save that, this now looks almost exactly the same as our mockup does over here. And that's everything that we need to do, except for this font is a little bit too small. This is why we use that band name large class. Inside of the band name large class, we're going to set the font size, and we're going to make it 9 EM. If we save that, that is now going to be much larger, and it is going to look almost identical to how large it is over here. And if you want, you can play around with this number, make it 8 EM for example, and save it, and it'll look great either way. Now that we have the header completely styled, let's move on to styling the section content of our web page. Over in the about.html page, let's add a class to our section, and we're just going to call this content section. Essentially clarifying that this section is just for content, and we can reuse this on all of our other content sections across our index and our store page. I also want to give it a class of container, which we will use to specify a maximum size as well as some paddings on the outsides of our text, so that way it's not quite squished up all the way against the edge of the screen. Back in styles.css, let's use the .content section class that we just created and give it a margin of 1 EM. This will give us a little bit of spacing on the top, left, right, and bottom of our element, so that way it distinguishes itself from the previous element. Then we'll use our .container class that we just created, and in here we'll style a max width, which says that the max width of our element is going to be 900 pixels wide. This means if our element tries to get any larger than 900 pixels, it'll just stay at 900 pixels. If I save that and increase my screen size, you can see that this element stops at 900 pixels. But as you saw, it was showing up on the left side instead of centered. To center it, we're going to set the margin on top and bottom to 0, and then we're going to use auto as the left and right margin. This tells it that the margins on the left and right will be as large as they need to be and will be exactly the same, so that way the text will be always in the center. And if we bring this all the way over to the side, you'll see that we have a large margin on the right and left, which centers our text on the middle. And then lastly, we just want to add a little bit of padding back to this container to push it away from the sides, so we'll use 0 on the top and bottom and 1.5 EM on the left and right in order to give us a little space so that our text does not run right up against the edge of our web page. Next, we need to style the actual heading for this element. We can use another class on our H2 here, and we'll just call it section header. There we go. This is because all of our sections are going to be styled with the same exact header, so we will use this class again on our home page and our about page. Now in our styles.css, let's grab that section header class, and in here we're going to just use a font family, and this font family is called Metal Mania, which again is not on the computer by default, so we have to use another import URL from Google Fonts, and this import URL, like I said before, you can find by going onto the Google Fonts webpage and searching your font. This is what the URL is going to be for the Metal Mania font, and if we save that, you see that our text changes. You can also see that we have the same problem where our text is bolded as it was over here in the generics, so we'll just change the font weight to be normal. And now if we save that, you'll see that our text is no longer bolded, but it still doesn't look exactly as we want it to. And this is because we need to change the color on this to be slightly darker. We'll use just 333, which is about halfway between our light gray and completely black. And then we want to center this text in the middle of our screen, text align center. If we save that, you'll see that our section header is now in the middle of our screen. It's the right color, but it's slightly too small, and we'll use the font size property 2.5 EM to make it about 2.5 times bigger. Save that, and there we go. Our heading is perfect. Now the next element we need to take care of is the image in our About section. As you can see on here, the image is a circle and it's displayed towards the top of our text. And the text just flows perfectly around the image, no matter how large or small the image is. In order to do this, let's first add a class to our image, and we'll just call it our About Band image, because this is a class we're only going to be using for our About Band. And then in here, select that About Band image. And now, in order to make it so that our text flows around this image, what we want to do is we want to use the float property and tell it to float left. This means that the image will remove itself from the flow and float completely to the left side of the document. Also, as you can see, our image is quite large here, so let's give it a height of 200 pixels and a width as well of 200 pixels. And if we save that, you see that our text is flowing perfectly around this, but we want it to flow from the top. So in our About here, let's move our image above our p tags and save it. And now, as you can see, from the very start of our text, it is flowing around the image. But our text is right up against our image, and we don't want this. In order to fix this, let's give our image 15 pixels of margin on all sides in order to push the text away from the image. Lastly, in order to create a circle, we're going to use the border radius property. This property tells us how far we want to curve the edges of our border, and in our case, 50% will make a perfect circle since we curve from 50% all the way to the next 50%. So if we save that, we have a perfect circle with our text flowing around it as we expected. If we go over here, as you can see, it doesn't quite look exactly the same because our image is not at the very center of our text, it's at the very top, but it's much easier to style from the very top of the text, and I personally think it even looks better this way. As for the actual text of our content, we don't need to change anything because in our generic everything selector, we already set the font family and color to be exactly the same as what is over here. So the last thing we have left to do is address the footer, which we want to use a light blue background around with our band name on the left, as well as our 3 elements on the right for our buttons to go to YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook. In order to do this, we're going to need to supply some classes to the footer. We're going to use the class of main footer, similarly to how we used main header, to specify that this is the main footer on our web page. Then we're going to use the band name class and apply that to our band name. And if we save that and go back here, you'll see that our band name has already updated to be white text and the correct font and font color and font size, just because we already created that band name style before, which is the power of using classes, since they're so reusable to create many different elements and just copy and paste them along your page as you see fit. So now let's go back to our styles.css and style that main footer element. Our main footer is overall very simple. All we need to do is add a background color. That's going to be that light blue color here, which I just copied over. And then we're going to make all of the text in this main footer white, so we're going to use a color of white. And then lastly, we want to have a little bit of padding between our elements and the edge of the background, so we'll use a padding of 0.25 EM on the top and bottom, and then 0 on the left and right. And if we save that, scroll down, you see that we now have that light blue background, as well as all of our text is white. But we have the problem of our footer being stacked vertically when we want it to be stacked horizontally. In order to fix this problem, we're going to go back to our about.html, and we're going to use a second div element in here with the class of container and main footer container that will wrap all the content inside of our footer. There we go. And now in our styles.css, we'll make the main footer container. The purpose of this main footer container is to wrap our elements in a display flex element. A flex display, or also known as flexbox, is a very complex layout element that you can use in CSS, but we're only going to skim over the top of it because in this video we don't have the time to cover the full complexities of flexbox. But in the future I will make a video covering flexbox in depth. If we scroll down here, we see that already our elements have lined up next to each other on the left and the right, which is great. But we want our right side element to take up as much space as possible, while our left side element should be as small as possible. In order to do this, we'll make it so that main footer container, the UL inside of it, which is our navigation on the right here, we want it to grow to take up as much space as possible, so we'll use flex grow and give it a value of 1 to tell it to grow. Then we also want to align our text in that element to the end of the element, so we'll use text align end to tell our text to be on the right side instead of the left side. We also want it so that our YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook links will be centered with this band logo on the left here. To do this, we'll use the align items property and set it to center to center everything vertically inside of this flexbox. Next, all we need to do is style our navigation, which we've already created a class for. So on our UL, we'll add a class of nav, as well as footer nav, so that we can use specific stylings for our footer and save that. As you can see, it has already changed so that we have the background hover and the elements have lost their period on the left side, denoting that it's a list item. Now all we need to do in here is change our footer nav li so that we have a different set of padding around these elements. We'll use a padding of 0 on the top and bottom and 0.5 em on the left and right to give these elements a little bit of space around each other. Next, we're going to make it so the images are going to be quite a bit smaller than they are right now, since they're a bit oversized. So we'll use the footer nav, select all the images, give them a width of 30 pixels and a height of 30 pixels. And if we save that, we see that now everything is center aligned together inside of the footer. Our images are smaller, they have the hover element, which is the same from this navigation up here, and they also allow us to click them and go to their links. The great thing about this web page is that it's also responsive on different sizes. So if we increase the size of our page, you see that everything flows great around each other without breaking. Everything's working, everything looks great, whether it's full size or small. It doesn't matter, it'll work flawlessly. This web page is, though, not designed specifically with mobile sizing in mind, so it doesn't look as good on a small screen size as it does on a slightly larger screen size, but either way, it looks great no matter which size the browser is at. And that is all there is to creating the About band page for this website. We have all the stylings so that our page looks almost exactly the same as the mockup that we had before, and it is even scalable to different browser sizes and looks good on all those different sizes. The best part about this is since that we used very generic named classes such as container, band name, and nav, we're able to apply these classes to the rest of our pages, such as the home page here and the store page here, in order to get a head start without having to restyle the elements such as this navigation and the footer every single time. If you guys want to follow along with this project and use the exact same code that I have to style this About page here, all of this code is going to be available on my GitHub, which will be linked in the description below. From there, you can get these font files that I'm using, as well as the different logos and background images that I'm using, and even the actual code for this video is available on my GitHub. We're going to tackle styling the homepage of our website to look exactly as this image on the right here. In order to get started with this, let's open up our index.html page with live server, and here we have all of the HTML with no CSS stylings applied to it. The first thing that we want to do is to go into our about.html, copy our link tag from the head, and paste this into our index.html file. This way we'll be able to load the styles in from our styles.css file into our homepage here. As you can see, this already made some changes by changing our font color, and etc. based on our everything selector. The next thing that we need to do is apply our styles to our header that we created in the last episode, such as the class of main header, And if we save this, we'll see that on the right, our header will update. And then we have our navigation, which we can apply the classes of nav and main nav to. And there we go. We'll get rid of this HR here, as well as these 2 line breaks and our comment, since these are no longer needed since we have a background image, and these line breaks will be taken care of using CSS. Let's save that, and then add our final class here for the band name, and band name large. And if we save that, our header now looks very similar to how our about page header looks, but we have these 2 buttons down here that we need to style still. The first thing we want to do is create a button class for all of our buttons. We'll do this in a similar way that we styled our navigation elements by having a nav class and then another class to style what type of nav it is. But first, we'll just create this generic button class that all of our buttons will be able to use. Inside of our styles.css, let's add the selector for that button class and start applying the different styles we need. We know that we want all of our buttons' text to be centered in the middle and center of our button, so we'll use text align center to put our text in the center horizontally, and then we'll be using vertical align of middle to put our text in the middle vertically. If we save that, we'll notice that no changes were made over here because our buttons aren't tall enough or wide enough for our text to need to be aligned in the middle yet. But as we start adding different paddings and different heights and widths, we'll see that our text will always be in the center. Next, let's add a little bit of padding around our button so that we have more space between the text and the edge of our button. To do this, we'll use padding, and then we'll give it 0.67 EM of padding on both the top, bottom, left, and right by just doing one number. And if we save that, we'll see that our buttons have gotten slightly larger. Last thing we want to do is when we hover over our button, we want our cursor to change to a pointer icon as opposed to the normal arrow icon. So we're going to go into here, change our cursor to pointer, and save that. And now when we hover over our buttons, we'll get the pointer icon instead of the typical arrow icon. The next thing we want to do is apply our button specific classes for our header, and we'll just call this button header. Now if we go into our styles.css, use the selector for our button header class, we can start adding styles that are specific for this Get or Latest Album button. The first thing we want to do is use the margins around our button to be able to position it where we want. If we look at our image here, we can see that our button is positioned so that it is slightly offset from the center and offset from the left edge of the screen. We're going to be using margins with percentages and EMs in order to accomplish this. So if we use margin, the first value, if we use all 4 values of margin, corresponds to the top margin, which we want to set to 0.5 EM, which will be half the size of the font. We then want to use 15% to correspond to our right side margin, which will take up 15% of the total space our object can occupy. Then we can use 2 EM as the bottom margin and another 15% as the left side margin. If we save this, we see that our object already aligns itself slightly offset from the left and not quite centered in our space. This is exactly what we want. Next, we want to style the button to look like it does on this page. The first thing that we're going to want to do is change the text color to be white. And then we want to add a border around our object. It's going to be 2 pixels, solid, and we're going to use this color, which is a slightly bluish color, as our border color. Now if we save that and go back, we already see that our text color has changed to white, and we have a blue border around the object, but we still have this gray background. In order to get rid of that, we just set the background color, and we're going to use a very, very opaque white color, which will be RGBA, 255, 255, and 0.1. And if we save that, we now get a button that looks very similar to this button in color, but spacing is still not quite right. What we need to do is set the border radius of our object to be 0, which will completely remove the rounded corners of our object so that we now have a perfectly square cornered object over here, just like in this image. The border radius corresponds to how rounded the corners are, so by setting to 0, we have no rounded edges to our corner. Next, we want to increase the font size. We're just going to set that to 1.5 EM to be about 50% larger, and then we want to make the font weight to be lighter so that the text is slightly thinner. And if we save that, our button is looking very similar to our button over here, but you'll notice that we don't quite have the same padding on the left and right. In order to fix this, we'll set our padding on the left to be 2em and our padding on the right to also be 2em. Now if we save that, our button looks almost exactly the same as our button in here. This is perfect. But when we hover over this button, nothing actually happens. We have no way to know we're actually hovering over it. In order to fix that, we'll use the button header hover selector here, and we'll set the background color, and we'll just make it a slightly less opaque version of the color that it already is, which is white, but we'll use 0.3 instead of 0.1 as our opacity. So now if we hover over it, you see that our button gets slightly lighter, so that way we know that we're actually hovering over top of it. One thing that you may notice is if we zoom out here on our image and we increase our font or our window size to be even larger, our button will become very offset to the left and not as centered as we like it to be. In order to fix this, in our index.html page, let's wrap this button here inside of a div with the class of container. If we do this, we've already created this container class which has a limited width. This means the padding of our button on the left and right will be inside of that confined width space of the container. So if we save this and increase our size of our browser to be even larger, you see that our button will always stay similar to the center of the screen because it's inside of a container with a limited width. That's exactly what we want our web page to react as. Now let's zoom that back in so it's easier for you guys to see. There we go. And now let's work on styling this button right here for the play button. We'll use very similar styles to our header button, but we'll also add a play button class to this. If we save that, we already see that this is very similar to our style over here. What we want to do is we want to make this button entirely round, and we want to make the icon on the inside blue as opposed to white. In order to do this, we'll go to our styles.css here, and we'll use our button play class to style our play button how we want. The first thing we want to do is center our button horizontally in the screen, so we're going to use margin with 0 on the top and bottom and auto on the left and right in order to tell our button to center itself in the screen. But as you'll notice, our button actually just centers over onto the left side. This is because buttons are not block level elements, and only block elements can have an auto margin. To get around this, we'll change our button to be display block. And now if we save that, we'll notice our button is perfectly centered in our screen. The next thing we want to do is change the color of this icon to be our blue color here, which we can just copy from our border. Save that, and now we have that same blue color inside of our button. We want to increase the font size. In order to make the icon larger, we'll use 4em. And then we want to change our border radius to be 50% in order to make a perfect circle. And there we go. But you'll notice that our button is more of an oval than a circle, and that's because our button has different padding on it, so we need to completely remove the padding from our button in order to make it a perfect circle. But you'll see there's a slight problem where our button gets really scrunched up, so we want to give our button a width and a height, and we're going to make these exactly the same so our button is a perfect circle as opposed to an oval. We'll just use 100 pixels. And if we save that, you see that we now have a perfect circle button in the center of our screen that is slightly offset from our button up here, very similarly to over here. And if we increase the size of our screen, you see that our buttons will stay positioned how we want them, no matter what size our screen is. That's exactly what we want, and everything that we need to do in order to make the header of our page look exactly the same as this image over here. The next thing that we need to do is work on this section of our page, which contains our tour dates and is the main content of this home page. The first thing we can do is use our styles that we created in our previous video. We can use our class over here of content section in order to specify that this is a content section, and we can also use the class container in order to specify that we don't want the width to grow over a certain size. Next, we can use the class here of section header, just as we created in our other video. That'll mark this header as a section header and center and give it the right font that we want. Now, we need to tackle the individual rows of our tour date. The first thing we can do is remove the HR as well as these less than and greater than symbols since these were only there in order to be used for spacing in our HTML, and we will do all of that with CSS now instead. So now if we save that, we see that our row is completely scrunched together, which is perfect for us to start styling. We also want to give our row a class of toArrow so that we can say each row will be styled in the same exact way. Let's go into our styles.css here, add that toArrow selector, and get started styling it. The main thing we want our toArrow to do is to give us padding between our different rows, as well as give us a border on the bottom of the row. So to start, let's use border bottom to give a bottom border to our row, and we'll make it 1 pixel solid black. And if we save that, we see that we now have that border on the bottom of our object, similar to how the HR worked. But we also want there to be a little space between the row and the row below it, as well as between the row and the border. In order to give us space between the row and the border, we'll use padding, since padding is space between the content and the border, and we'll set this to 1em. If we save that, we now have space between our content and our border, and in order to give us space between the content below and our border, we use margin, which is on the outside of our border, and we'll set that to the same 1em. Now if you save that, we have spacing between all of our rows here. Let's take this toArrow class and give it to all of the different rows inside of our content here. We can just copy and paste that into all these divs, and after we're done with that, if we save it, we'll see that we now have borders on the bottom here. Let's get rid of all of these HRs so that it's easier to see. And you'll see now that we have borders on the bottom of all of these different rows, very similar to over here, but you'll notice there should be no border on our last row here. And you may think, oh, we'll just remove the class and that'll solve the problem, but that will get rid of all of our padding and margins. In order to fix this problem, we can use what is called the last child selector. So if we do toArrow last child, this will select the last child with this toArrow class. And if we just give it a border bottom of none to say that there should be no border and save it, you'll see the border on this last child has been completely removed. Now we can get started on styling the different elements inside of our row. Let's first start with the date element here, and we're going to give this a class of toItem, which we'll give to all the items in our row, and we'll give it a specific class of toDate, and this will work very similar to how we've done buttons and navs so far. Let's first start by styling the toItem element. In here, all we want to do is set very specific paddings, margins, spacings, all of that we want between all of our tour items. So first, we want to add a padding right between all of our elements to give them a little bit of space of 0.5 em. If we save that, we'll see that now there's a little bit of padding to the right side of our date element here, which is exactly what we want. But we also want these elements to display inline with a specific width. As we know, inline elements cannot have any width applied to them. For example, if we were to apply a width of 1000 pixels here and save this, our object does not actually become 1000 pixels wide, and that's because it's an inline element. So what we want to do is change the display to the inline block, which will make this act like an inline element, as in it won't break the line when it's done, but it'll also be able to have widths and heights applied to it like a block element. And if we save that, we see our element is now 1000 pixels wide. We don't actually want that, so we'll remove that line. Perfect. The only downside of inline block is it does add a tiny bit of space between each element that we cannot actually remove, but that is okay for now. Now let's use that toDate class that we also assigned it and start styling that as well. First, we want to give it a slightly darker color than the rest of our row to match the styling in this page, so we'll give it a color of 555, which is a slightly darker version of our 777 color, and if we save that, you'll see our color is a little bit darker. We also want to make it so that it's bold, so we use font weight of bold, and if you save that, you notice not much actually changes, and that's because we used a strong tag over here for our element. Strong tags are meant only when you want to emphasize something, and in this case, our bolding is only for visual instead of for emphasis, so we want to change this to a span tag in order to remove the special emphasis applied to it, since it is only meant to be visually bolded and not actually emphasized for importance. Now if we save that, you'll see it'll look perfect. Let's go back to our style.css and give this a specific width, and we'll just use 11% for our width here. And save that, and now it gives us a little bit of extra spacing and as we increase the size of our browser, the spacing will increase with it. Perfect. Now let's move on to the other elements of our tour item. Instead of our index.html, let's give all of our elements the tour item class, as well as a specific class. In this case, this is our city, so we'll call it tour city. This next one is going to be our arena, so we'll give it tour item and tour arena. And this last one is our button, so we'll give it the class of button. We'll also give it a tour item class and a tour button class, and save that. Now our row looks a little bit better, has a little bit of spacing between our elements, but everything's not quite lined up how we want it. So in our styles.css here, let's style our individual tour elements, starting with the city element, which we're just going to give a width of 24%, since this is slightly larger text than our date is. And we save that, and now it gives us a little bit of spacing. We'll go on to our tour arena, and we'll give this a width of 42%, since this is our largest element by far. And then lastly, we'll use the tour button, and instead of giving this an actual width, because if we give it a width, for example, of 19%, and we save that, as we increase our screen size, we'll see that our button will get wider, which we don't actually want to happen. So instead, we'll use max width as opposed to widths, which means our element will never be larger than 19% of the screen. So now if we shrink this, our button will stay exactly the same no matter how large or how small it goes, because the width will always be the same as the content, but it'll never become larger than 19% of the screen. So if we make our screen very small, you'll see that our button will break onto 2 lines instead of shrinking even further. That's exactly what we want. You also may be wondering, by looking at these widths, why they don't exactly add up to 100%, because you would think we want to fill up 100% of this space. And you are correct, we do want to fill up 100% of this space, but as I talked about, inline block elements add some amount of spacing between each other inline block element that we cannot remove. We have to account for this by making our widths slightly less than 100% when added together. To do this, I subtracted about 1% from each of these widths after making them total up to 100%. This way we have 96% width taken care of, so that way our screen won't break onto multiple different lines until it becomes very, very small, and in that case you'll see it does break onto multiple lines. But that is okay, because our screen is not really meant to be viewed on mobile. This is mostly for desktop design. Let's make that size a little bit larger here. There we go. And let's copy these styles onto all of our different elements over here in all of our different rows. I'll do that really quick. And there we go. As you can see, now all of our rows are styled correctly. They all line up exactly, so the spacing is exactly what we want it to look like. And if we increase the size of our browser, everything stays in line in all of our different columns and scales to be responsive with the size of our browser. This is perfect. The only thing we have left to do is style our buttons so that they look the same on this page as they do on this page. In order to do that, let's add one final class to our buttons, which will be button primary, since this will be the primary button of our site, and this primary attribute really refers mostly to the coloring of our button, since our button base class already applies all of the styling for the different sizing, padding, and margins that we need. So now if we go over to our styles.css, add this button primary class in here, we can now style the different colors we need to. Let's first start by adding the color of white, which will make our text color white, as well as our background color, which we want to set to this color. And if we save that, we now see our buttons are the exact same color as over here. We next want to remove all of the border from this element so we don't have this gray border around here anymore. And then we want to make our border radius to be slightly bent around the corners. As you can see over here, we have a slight bend in the corner. So we'll make our border radius be 0.3 em. And if we save that, you see that our button is already looking great, but our text is a little bit dull in here. So let's make the font weight bold to make our text pop a little bit. And if we save that, our buttons now look perfect, and they look exactly the same as our buttons over here. The only thing we have left to do is add a hover element to this so that we can tell that we're hovering over our element. We'll do this exactly the same way by using our button primary with the hover selector, and we'll just give it a background color that is going to be slightly darker. So in here, we'll go background color, and we'll just set that to this color right here. Now if we hover over our button, you'll see that it'll get darker to note that we are hovering over this button, and it is easier for our users to know what's going on. The last thing we have left to do is style the footer to be exactly the same as the footer on our About page. So in order to do this, we'll just go to our About page, go down to the footer, and copy all of the footer elements, IDs, classes, all of that, and we'll paste it over our footer here, since we know that we want them to be exactly the same. And now if we save that, we scroll down here, our footer now looks exactly the same as our footer over here, which is exactly what we want. Now, if we zoom out our web page here a little bit to be 100%, increase the size, you'll see that our content stays inside of these bounds, and that is due to the container class that we added. This is perfect for making our site responsive without stretching too far on larger screens, and also making it look decent on smaller screens such as this or this. That's all there really is to creating the CSS for this homepage. You'll notice that this was much easier than doing our About page, and that is because all the styles that we used in our About page, we were able to copy over and use in our homepage. We're going to be taking the store page that we've designed earlier with HTML and style it to look exactly like this image on the right here. Now let's get started here by opening up our store HTML page using Live Server to see what we have to get started with. Here we go. And the first thing that we need to do is copy over the style sheet that we've already created and link it. So we'll just copy this link here from the index page, paste it into our store page. So we now have access to all the styles that we've already written, and as you can see, it's already taken effect. The next thing that we need to do is go into our header here, and we need to style our header to be exactly like our home page and our About page, as you can see here. So to do that, let's just add the classes that we've already created of main header. In our nav, we're going to add the class of main nav, and then nav, and there we go. That looks good. Let's remove this HR, and then finally style our band name here with band name and band name large. We save that, and there we go. We have the same header that we have on all of our other pages. And luckily for us, this is the only thing we need to do in our header here. The next thing we can do is move on to this section and work on this music cart section right here. We can get started here by styling our section with the classes that we already have, such as container and content section. If we save that, you'll see we get a little bit of padding from doing that. And then we can also title our header here by using the class of section header, which we've already created. If we save that, we now see that our header for our section is properly styled. And now we can move on to styling the actual items that are going to be going into our cart. Let's first look at what we actually want the style to look like over here in our image. And we can see that we have the title of the item at the very top centered. We have the image here, and then we have the price and the button to add it to the cart on the bottom that are slightly inset from the sides of the album image. So in order to do that, let's first add a class to this div that wraps all of this content here. And we're just going to call this shop item. And this is just going to represent a single item that we have for sale in our shop, and this will be usable in the music and the merch section. The next thing we can do is we can actually remove the divs that wrap this album, since we can use CSS in order to make album on its own line without having to use a div to do that. So let's remove these divs here. And then we can also change the strong tag to a span, since we know that we want this album one to be bolded, but we don't actually want to put emphasis on it that the strong tag does for things like screen readers. We just want to style that in CSS. So let's add a class to this here, and we're just going to call this shop item title, since this is going to be the title and the name of our shop item that we have here. Next, we have our image, which we are going to add a class to as well. We can just call this shop item image, so that we can style our image to resize it as we need. And then lastly, we have this bottom div here, which are the details of our shop item. So we're just going to give this a class. We'll call it shop item details. And inside of that, we have the price of the shop item here. So we can give that the class of shop item price. And then we have our button here, which we already have two classes for, of button and button primary, since this will be the bluish colored primary button that we have. And then we'll add another class to it of shop item button, so we can style this button specifically for the shop item as needed. And if we save that, go back to here, you'll see that some of the things in our page have already changed. We got the blue button now, and now we can actually go into our styles.css and start styling these elements. The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to give some margin around our shop items so that they don't run up right next to each other, as you can see that these two items are. So if we go in here, we select our shop item, we can just give it a margin on all sides of 30 pixels. And if we say that, you now see that we have spacing on the sides, bottom, top of these shop items so that they won't run right up against each other. The next thing we can do is style this shop item title right here. To do that, we'll just select the shop item title and we'll get started styling it. The first thing we want to do is we want to make it so that it is display block, so that way it'll be on its own line as opposed to being in front of the image if the width of our browser is large enough. The next thing we want to do is we want to make this item 100% width so that it'll take up the entire width of the top of the image, and that way when we do text align center, the text will actually center itself above the image, just like that. The next thing we can do is change the actual size and color of the font. So if we go in here, we can make the font weight bold so it is a little bit larger. We can make the font size be 1.5 EM so it is also slightly bigger. And then lastly, add a color that is slightly darker than our current color here. If we save that, you see that we now have a great title, but it's really close to our image. So we'll just add a margin on the bottom here. And we'll make that about 15 pixels. And we save that, and now we see it spaced out above our image, which is perfect. This is exactly what we want for our title. The next thing that we should tackle is the actual image of our shop item. Right now this image is quite large and takes up almost the entire screen. So what we want to do is we just want to change that so that our shop item image is slightly smaller than it is right now. So we'll just give it a height of 250 pixels. If we save that, you'll see that our image shrinks down a little bit, and the width and the aspect ratio stays the same because by default, the width will be automatically as large as it needs to be for the image to be the same aspect ratio when the height is 250 pixels. This is because we didn't actually set a width, so it defaults to auto. Next, we want to work on this details row down here where we have the price and the button for adding it to our cart. So let's go into here and we'll do shop item details. To select the wrapper that goes around our details for our price and our button here, and we'll make this display flex. There we go. The reason we're using display flex is because we want to center these items vertically so that they are all within the same line. As you can see, this price is at the top of the line here, and we want it to line up with the text in our button. So to do that, we'll use align items center in order to centrally align all of the items inside of this container. And as you can see, this looks perfect over here. The last thing we want to do is add a little bit of padding of 5 pixels on the top, bottom, left, and right, so that way it's slightly inset from the image and doesn't quite touch the image on the top. Next, we can move on to styling the actual price of our shop item. So we'll do shop item price. And this doesn't take many styles. All we want to do is make it so that the button is shoved all the way to the right side of the screen. So we'll set flex grow to 1 so that our price will take up as much width as possible. If we save that, you see that it pushes this add to cart button all the way to the end of our container right here. Next thing we want to do is change the color to make it slightly darker. And that's really all there is to styling the actual item of our shop. But what we want to do is we want to make it so that these shop items will all flow around each other. And as you can see, our shop item doesn't quite fit within the space of the image. It's taking up way too much of the width of the screen. In order to fix this, we can go back to our HTML here, and we can wrap all of these shop items inside of a div, and we'll just give it a class of shop items. So if we go up here, create a div, give it a class of shop items. There we go. We put the end of this div at the end of all of our shop items for the music section right here, and indent everything so that it looks nice. There we go. And now we can actually select that shop items div that we created, and we can give it a display of flex. And if we say that, you now see that everything's all on one line. and it goes all the way past the edge of our screen. We do not want that. We want these items to actually wrap, so we can use the property flex wrap in order to make these elements wrap, and we'll just set it to wrap so that if it goes past the edge of our screen, they'll wrap down, and as you can see, now they all fill up in one column instead of wrapping all the way to the end of the screen. You'll also see, by changing flex, our display to flex here for the shop items, our image is the total width of our item so that our add to cart button doesn't get put all the way to the end here, and our album 1 title is properly centered above the image. This is exactly what we want. The last thing we want to do is when our screen is larger, these items will be right next to each other like this. And we want to make sure that there's space between them in the middle, left, and right. So we'll use justify content space around, which will put an even amount of space on the left and right of every single element inside of our container. And if we save that, we now see we have spacing between these elements and on the left and right of them. That's exactly what we want for these shop items. Now all that's left to do is to create all of these different classes and add them to all the different shop items, which I'll do real quick here. And there we go. That's all the styles that we need for our shop item. So now, as you can see, as we scroll down, all of our buttons and prices are styled correctly. Everything's lined up properly. And if we increase the size of our screen, you'll see that our items will line up next to each other, which means that our site is actually responsive to different screen sizes. This is because we use display flex with the wrap property, so that if it became too large for our screen, it would just wrap to the next line. And if our screen was large enough to allow multiple items, they would all stay on the same line. This is perfect for our situation, since we didn't want our albums to only take up one line or be two on a line when our screen was very small. So now what we need to do is do the same thing to our merch section as we've done to this section here by wrapping our container in a shop items div and then adding all of these different classes down to these elements here. I'll do that real quick now. And there we go. I've added all the different styles to our merch section, since it's pretty much exactly the same as this music section here. And as you can see, if we increase our screen size to be large enough, there we go. Our items will be side by side, and if the screen size is not large enough, they'll stack on top of each other just like this. And this is a perfect example of our Flexbox working, because as you can see, these are side by side, but these are not, because this coffee image is actually wider than these images up here, so it needs a wider screen size in order for them to stack side by side like this. Now the last thing that we have to tackle is the actual cart down here, which is going to be the most complex part of this page, so stick with me. The first thing we need to do is go back into our HTML and style the different HTML elements that we need with classes so that we can style it to look exactly like the cart down here. So first, let's take the classes that we know we already have for this section. We can do container, and we can do content section. There we go. We can also style this header here with section header. There we go. And now let's get into the actual rows and headers of our cart. Right here, we don't need these less than and greater than signs anymore, since we're going to be putting the spacing in using CSS. And same with these strong tags, we can replace these with spans. So let's do that real quick. There we go. And now let's start adding the actual classes that we need. The first thing that we want to do is style the wrapper that goes around each of our rows. And we're going to just give that a class of cart row. And then we want to do classes for our different items. So we have our item column, our price column, and our quantity column. Since we want all these to line up and be the same width, we'll give this a class, and then we're going to give that cart item, and we'll also give it a class of cart header, since this item is in the header of our cart. And then lastly, we'll use the cart column class, which we're going to give to all of our different columns of our cart section, so that way we can do consistent styling between all of our columns without having to copy and paste it other places. Let's do a similar thing for the price here. We're going to give it a class of cart price, class of cart header, and a class of cart column. And then lastly, same thing for quantity. Give it a class cart quantity, cart header, and cart column. And there we go. That's everything we need to do in order to style the header row of our cart. Let's start by styling that in our style sheet right now. The first thing we want to do is style the actual headers of our columns. So to do this, we can use the class cart header to select them, and then set a font weight of bold, since these are going to be bolded. We can set a font size to be slightly larger at 1.2 EM. And then lastly, we want to make the color darker, so we'll just use this color that's slightly darker. And then we can move on to styling the actual individual columns themselves. So let's use the selector cart column here and get started styling that. In here, we can use a border bottom. We'll just use 1 pixel solid black border in order to put a border on the bottom here. But we also need spacing between our elements, because if we go back here, you'll notice that our borders are all running right up against each other, and this image is even overlaying over the top of our borders. In order to get around this, we're going to use some margins around our elements here. First, let's use a margin on the right side in order to space our columns away from each other. And we're just going to use a margin of 1.5 EM here. If we save that, you'll see that now there's some spacing between our different columns. We're also going to put a padding on the bottom, so there's spacing between the column and the actual underline. So we'll use padding bottom here of 10 pixels. And then we'll also put a margin on the top of our columns in order to put a little bit of space between the top of our column and everything above it. So in this case, the actual border of the element for this column. So we'll use margin top 10 pixels here, and perfect. Now we need to actually add these classes to the rest of our items inside of our columns. To do this, let's go back to our store HTML and copy over all of these classes to these other different elements here. Let's do this for the first one. We'll copy over this class cart row, put it onto this div here. We also have the cart item, which is going to include both the image here and this t-shirt name. So we need to wrap this inside of a div with the class of cart item. So we say this is our item column, and then we'll also give it a cart column class, since it's going to be a column inside of our section here. Put the end of the div down at the bottom. And now if we save this, you already see that we started getting borders on the bottom, which is perfect. Next, we can move over this cart price to be inside of this span here, since this is the price for our item. So we'll give a class of cart price and another class of cart column. There we go. We can also remove these less than and greater than symbols here again, since they're just used for spacing. And then lastly, we have our cart quantity, which includes the input and button down here. So we can do a similar thing where we wrap them inside of a div. So if we paste this div here, instead of cart item, we want cart quantity. And then inside of that div, we just want the input and the button. And there we go. Now we have everything we need, but you'll see that they're spaced out so that they're all on their line of their own. And in order to get around this, what we want to do is we want to use Flexbox again in order to align these items properly. So if we go back to our styles.css, let's style that cart row, and we use display flex in order to get all these items onto one line, just like that. That's perfect. We're now running into the problem though, where our columns are different widths. As you can see, this item column here is not wide enough to support all the stuff in it. The price column doesn't line up with the actual price here, and the quantity is way off. In order to fix this, we'll use these cart item class, the cart price class, and the cart quantity class that we applied to our different columns in order to style the widths of these columns so they're all exactly the same. For our item, let's use a width of 45%. There we go. For the price, we're going to use a width of 20%. And lastly, for the quantity, we'll use a width of 35%. If you save that, you'll see that now everything lines up inside of the columns that they should be inside of. You'll also notice that if you add these numbers up, they equal 100%. But if you remember from our first video, when we were styling, actually our second video, I'm sorry, when we were styling the home page, you'll notice that we had to not quite equal 100% when we were creating our widths. This is because we are using inline block elements to style those, and inline block elements have spacing around them. Here we're using flexbox to align our items, so we can actually use widths that add up to exactly 100% because flexbox does not add any spaces in between the items inside of its container. This is why I almost always use flexbox when laying out elements as opposed to inline block. Flexbox is also great at aligning content inside of its box to be centered horizontally or vertically, which is a problem you'll notice on the right here, where our content should be centered horizontally, or vertically, in order to look like this, so that all of our text is right in the center here. But over here, our text is either at the bottom, over here, or the top over here. So to fix that, we'll go back to our cart column here, since if you remember, all of our content for each of these columns has this cart column class around it. And we'll make this display of flex, and then we'll use align items center in order to center our items along the vertical right here. If we save that, you'll see that now all of our items are vertically aligned exactly as they should be, and this is looking really close to what we have over here, minus all of the coloring that we need to do for our different elements. In order to specifically select the different elements we want to style, let's go back into our HTML here and add some classes to our different elements. The first element that we'll want to style here is the span tag with the title of the element. So what we'll do here is we'll add a class, we'll give it the title or the name of cart item title to specify this as the title of our cart item. We also want to add a class here to our image, so we'll just use cart item image to specify this is the image of our cart item. Our cart price is already styled, which is perfect, and then we just need to add styles to our input and our button here. So let's do class here. We'll just give it cart quantity input in order to specify this is the input for our cart quantity, and then our button will have the class of button, which we've already defined, button danger, which will specify a red colored button, and then also cart quantity button in order to specify that this is the button for our cart quantity. If we save that, you'll notice nothing over here changes other than the button styles are applied to this button. So then we can go into our styles.css and actually start selecting and styling these elements. So let's go down here, and first let's style the actual title, the t-shirt title here, by using cart item title selector. And then inside of this title selector, we'll put the color to be a slightly darker color. We'll give it a little bit of margin on the left side so that it's not quite right up against our image here, as you see. So we'll just use 0.5 EM for this. And then lastly, we'll increase the font size slightly to 1.2 EM. If you save that, you'll now see that our image is slightly pushed away from our item name, which is exactly what we want. Next thing we can style is the actual image, since our image is a little bit too large right here. So we can go in here, cart item image. We'll change the width to be 75 pixels so that this image is smaller. If we save that, you see our image is now smaller, but the height is too tall. So we're going to give it a height of auto, so the height will automatically adjust to the width. And if we save that, it's now within perfect aspect ratio that it was before. And lastly, we'll just add a slight rounding of the corners here. So we're just going to use border radius. And we'll just say, for example, 10 pixels. If we save that, it now rounds the borders just a little bit, which adds a little bit of extra aesthetic to the image, I think. The next thing we want to target is this price over here. And we already have a cart price selector, so let's just do it inside of that. We'll increase the font size slightly to be 1.2 EM, and we'll make the color slightly darker. And if we save that, we'll see that the price now looks good, and we really don't have to do anything to that. The last two elements, though, our input and our button, are going to take a little bit more work. Let's go down here and we can select that button danger class that we added earlier to apply this reddish colored button, and we can start adding our classes to this. The first thing that we want to do is change the color of the text to be white, and we want to give it a background color here that is going to be a reddish color. Just paste that in here. That'll be a red color, and if we save that, we'll see that we now have this reddish button. We'll want to remove the border from the button, give it a slight border radius so that it has rounded corners, and then lastly, increase it so that it is a bold font here. And if we save that, we now have a good looking button, but we have no hover that happens when we go over the button. So let's add our hover effect using the hover selector here, and we can just give it another background color that is going to be slightly darker here. And if we save that and we hover, we now get a slightly darker red color when we hover over the button, which is perfect. The next thing we can select is our cart quantity input, which is going to take quite a few styles applied to it in order to give it a bluish border and a smaller size. The first thing we want to do for this is to make it the same height as our button over here. So to do that, we'll use a height of 34 pixels, save that, and we'll see that our input is now the same height as our button. We also want to change the width of this input to be quite a bit smaller, so we'll use a width of 50 pixels, which should be enough space in order to put our text and have these buttons for incrementing and decrementing the number inside of here. The next thing we want to do is we want to give it a border radius, so it has slightly rounded corners. We'll give it a border radius of 5 pixels. We'll give it also a border that's going to be 1 pixel. It's going to be solid colored, and we want it to be the same exact color as our buttons up here. So we'll just copy that background color from our button, and we'll paste that in here. Now when we save that, you'll see that we now have the border around our element, which is great. We need to give it a slightly darker colored background, which is just slightly darker than white. And if we say that, you can see that. We want to change our text color to be slightly darker. And then we want to make sure we have no padding around this element at all. And if we save that, our input element is starting to come together. We just want to move our text to the center and make it slightly bigger here. So we'll do text align center. In order to center align our text, we use a font size here of 1.2 EM to make our font slightly larger. And then lastly, let's use some margin on the right here, 25 pixels, in order to separate our input from our button. And if you save that, you see that now this looks a lot like our mockup over here for our button and input. And that's pretty much all we need to do in order to style our row properly. Now I'm going to copy these styles from this row onto the second row and see what we have from there. And there we go. That's all the styles that I'm going to need in order to make this. We can also remove the HR down here at the bottom. And we can also remove this cart quantity button class, since we never actually ended up using that class. So let's remove that from both of our buttons here and save that, and you'll notice that everything still looks exactly the same. You will notice, however, though, that our underlined borders here don't quite look the same as over here. As you can see, we have a solid border on the bottom for our last row, and over here we have a separated border on the bottom. In order to do this, we can use the last child selector in our CSS in order to change the border for the last child. But the child element selector only works for the last child inside of a container. And right now, these cart rows are not the last child of the container that they're inside. As you can see, this div right here is the last child. So let's wrap the rows of our cart here inside of a container. And we'll just give this container here a class of cart items. Move this div down to the bottom here. Now we can indent all of this so it looks pretty. Save it, and you'll notice nothing over here actually changes, which is perfect. But now when we select the last child of the cart row, it'll be this cart row right here, since it's the last child of this cart items container. So now let's do that inside of our styles.css here. First thing that we're going to do is select the cart row, last child of it. And in here, we're going to use that border bottom property in order to set a 1 pixel solid black border that is going to go across the entire row here. If we save that, you'll see that we now have one solid border on the bottom, but we still have our individual borders that we want to remove. To do that, we'll again select the cart row last child, but we'll also select the cart columns that are children of that actual cart row, and we'll remove the border from them. And if we save that, you'll see that now we have removed these individual borders, and all we have is this solid lined border right here on the bottom, and that looks exactly the same as over here, which is perfect. Now all we need to do is style this total section and this purchase button, and we'll be done with this entire band website. Let's first start by going into our HTML and adding some classes that we can select these elements with. First, we'll use the class here of cart total that'll wrap our total and the price of the total. And then we'll also use class here of cart total title, since this is going to be the title of total. And then in here we have the class of cart total price, since this is the actual total price. And then inside of our styles.css we can select those. So we have cart total, which is the row that wraps all of these. We'll give that a text align of end, so that our text will go to the end of the line here, just as it does over here. And then we can use the selector for our cart total title in order to change the actual text here of this. The first thing we want to do is make the font weight bold, since it is bolded in our design. So we'll change that to bold. We'll increase the font size to 1.5 EM, make the color black so it stands out, and we'll give it a little bit of margin on the right side. That way it'll be spaced away from our actual price, and we'll just say 20 pixels for that. And if we save that, that's starting to look a lot like over here, which is great. Last thing we need to do is just style the actual total price, so we can use cart total price to select that. We can give it a color that's slightly darker and a slightly larger font size, just so it sticks out a little bit more of 1.1 EM. And if you save that, this now looks almost exactly the same as this, but you'll notice that our total is very scrunched up here against the bar, so we just want to add a little bit of margin. So we'll say margin on the top here from our cart total is going to be 10 pixels. And we'll also add a margin on the right of 10 pixels so that our total isn't squished right up against the edge of our screen, and instead it has a little bit of extra space. And that looks great right there. Our cart section is now exactly as over here. The only thing we have left to do is this purchase button, which will be fairly simple since most of the classes we have are already defined. Let's go back to our store.html here. We can remove this div that wraps this section since we don't actually need that. And inside of here, we can add some classes of button and button primary, since this has the primary colored button. And we'll also add a class of button purchase, since this is going to be a purchase button. And if we save that, you'll see that we already have styled here from the primary button class. And if we go into our styles.css, we can add some styles specifically for this purchase button here. The first thing we want to do, change the display to block here, so that way we can center this button by using auto margins. So we'll use a margin here. On the top, we want 40 pixels to space it away from our total section. On the left, we want auto margin. On the bottom, we want 80 pixels. And on the right, we want another auto margin. And if we save that, you'll see that our purchase button is now centered with padding, or margin on the top, and an even larger margin on the bottom to put it away from the footer. The last thing we want to do is increase the font size to 1.75 EM so that it is a much larger button. And there we go, that looks great. And that's a huge button for them to click when they want to purchase their items. Now all we need to do is style the footer down here, and this is going to be very easy. All we can do is go into our index page here. We can copy our footer since we know it's exactly the same, and we can just paste that into our store HTML. And if we save that, we now have the footer down here, and it looks amazing. This looks exactly as the page over here. And as we increase the size of our browser, our elements will flow naturally around each other. You'll see all of our columns stay lined up here, no matter how large or how small our browser is. Everything looks great. And that's pretty much all there is to creating this store page for our band website. I really hope you guys were able to learn something from this video. Thank you guys very much.